this all set up. No, you're not supposed to be able to see my webcam. It might have popped up for a second. The webcam is still on. Oh. Well, you guys got to see me for a second. Now I turn it off. Cool. All right. I'm not too pretty in the morning, so. All right, here. No, this is not a replay from a few weeks ago, but this is going to be a continuation of the webinar from a couple weeks ago. If you guys have not done so, as I mentioned in the tweet yesterday, we are doing a straight continuation of last week's webinar. Last week we looked at range compositions from the flop. That's why you're asking. I forgot to change the title of this. This is turn range composition, and today is June 5th, not May 25th. So this is a continuation. The first few slides are the same. So the first few slides are the same, and then we're going to work into the turn, and we're going to use one of my favorite programs, PokerCoaching, to look at some of the turn spots, and we're going to look at some different turn hands. So it is 9 a.m. now. We got a lot of stuff to get to. Hopefully everyone is having a good World Series, or some of you guys out in Vegas right now. Today on the schedule, I have the WSOP $1,500 six max event. Six max event is at 4 p.m. today. Let me fix this really quick. Yeah, so that's the what's on the schedule today. Played the big 50 a couple times, cashed it, but did not make day 3. So we're about even on the series so far. So, all right. Looks like we have 112 people. Let's get started. We got a lot of stuff to get through today. So today we will be looking at turn range compositions. We'll be looking at the same example from the last webinar. King of diamonds, 8 of clubs, 4 of clubs, middle position, first big blind flop. And the main questions we're going to be looking is, how do equities shift on various turn cards? So last week we looked at the equities on this King 8-4 flop, range versus range. We're going to do a quick 5-minute review, and then we're going to move into the turn stuff. And what we're looking at is how those equities shift when different turn cards come out. And then how do range compositions shift on various turn cards? Remember, we're not concerned with the number of combos, but we're more concerned with the percentage of the range that certain categories of hands fall into. So we will be looking at that. And we're going to look at how our turn strategies are affected by these shifts in equity and the range composition. Laura, yes, the first replay is posted on YouTube. If you go on my Twitter, I posted a link to it yesterday. Go on Twitter to McMatto Poker, McMatto Poker, or on PokerCoaching.com Twitter. They have the replay, and then this replay will be posted, so you can go back and rewatch both of them. So as a refresher, this is the setup that we had from the first webinar. Middle position raises to 2.5 big blinds. Big blind defends. These are the ranges. In position range, about 18%. Out of position range, we just have them three betting queens, kings, and aces, ace, king, pure. Just those are never going to be in his range. Sometimes he'll 3-bet jacks. Sometimes he'll 3-bet tens. And then he's going to have various 3-bet bluffs, but they really just don't change the composition of the ranges too much, and it's just easier to do the range like this. And we're going to be looking at a 10-to-1 SPR, so a 10-to-1 stack to pot ratio. So we're looking at around like a 60 to 70 big blind starting stack. So I'll show you the setup that I used in PokerCoaching. Is the microphone loud enough? I just want to double check. All right, looks like I got some. All right, perfect. Someone said, is there any sound? My computer's turned to 95%. It looks like a lot of people are saying the sound is good. So Yeah. Perfect. Thank you guys. Um, so this was our flop analysis from last webinar. We got the two ranges plugged in here, and the imposition had a 61% range advantage to 61.38. It's a pretty significant range advantage. This program right here is Equilab, which you can download for free, and it's an equity calculator we can put in these two ranges. What we'll be seeing today is Pile Solver, a little more advanced version of this, but everything I'm doing, you can pretty much do in Equilab and see the ranges. And so if you don't want to spend the money on Pile Solver or whatever, you don't really need to. I just like the program, so I'm doing that. Little review. Here's the flop, and this is the range composition. So we got the middle position range here, and the key points to take away here were middle position had a big set advantage. Even though he only has 3 more combos of sets, he has 4 times as many sets as the imposition player as a proportion of his range. So he has a set 4% of the time versus only 1% out of imposition. And then he has the over pairs. And the big part was top pair. He has top pair 19% of the time. So over twice as much, almost twice as much as the big blind. And then the under pair is where the other big range advantage comes from. He has 11% under pairs, so the under pairs would be 9s, 10s, jacks, queens, so between 8s and kings, versus the under pairs only make up 3%. So imposition has 30% hands better than a pair of 8 versus only 13%, 14% for the out of position. And that's basically because the big blind is defending all this junky suited stuff because of the price they're getting. He's supposed to defend it, and that is why such a range advantage. The big blind has ace high or nothing over 60% of the time versus this tighter range here. In position, the middle, I'll always be referring to MP as the in position player, has ace high or nothing around 48% of the time. And we can go ahead and we'll look up, here is the simulation on Pio for this hand. I'll just go through this really quick because I want to show something on the flop. We got the out of position range here, same as that I showed you before. In position range, stack to pot ratio, basically effective stacks 100, 10, and then various bet sizes. I kind of just made this a simple various bet sizes, etc. And what I wanted to show you was the equities. And if you look at these, the coloring here, this is the in position equities. The darker green is the higher percentage of equity the hand has. So like, for example, pocket kings here has almost 95% equity against the big blinds range. All these kings have, over 80% equity. And then as you get into the yellows, these are closer to 50% equity hands. So like, for example, as you can see over here, ace 9 of spades has about 43% equity, ace 9 of hearts 43. And the one thing I want to show you just for why the in position has such a big equity advantage, let's look at the lowest equity hands. And the lowest equity hand here for in position is probably going to be the 9-10 of spades and the 9-10 of hearts. So as you can see in the bottom right here, the grid, 9-10 of spades and 9-10 of hearts each have about 28% equity against the big blinds range. So 28%, that's basically his worst hand for the in position player. And the 9-10 still has, 2 overs to the 8 and backdoor straight draws. And then if we look at the out of position, you're going to see a big thing. So look at the in position, lots of green, some yellow, and pretty much no orange or red, which would be the lowest equity hands. You can see the grid right here where my mouse is. Green, 100%, red, 0%. When I flip it, you're going to see a big difference. This is the big blinds range, and he has some green, and all his green is basically these top pairs, king, queen, all his pair of kings, and just look at all this red that he has. Just so much. He has so many low equity hands, and like 9 deuce of spades has 11% equity. 9-6 of spades has 14%, 6 deuce of spades, 13%, ace 5 off. All these ace 5 combos have like under 30% equity. So the key point I'm trying to say is big blind has a lot of garbage. in position doesn't have much garbage, and that leads to that 61% range advantage that MP has that we referred to last week. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at 4 different turn cards. So we have this King 8 4 board with 2 clubs, and we're going to look at 4 different turn cards. We're going to look at a complete brick, so the deuce of spades. We're going to look at a pair card. First, actually, we're going to look at the low flush completer, so the 3 of clubs, the high flush completer, the ace of clubs. We're going to look at the pairing card, so when an 8 comes and it pairs the board. And we're going to look at the straight completer. There should be an R there. The straight completer, so the 7 of hearts, when the gut shot, straight draw guts there on the flop. And what we're going to do on each card is talk about how the equities change and how range compositions change on each card. We'll be using the Range Explorer on each card just to see how the range compositions change. And this will kind of also serve as a slight introduction on effective use of PioSolver and how you can use it in kind of a non-technical way to learn these range compositions and equities. And there will be some participation on each card before I show you the slide and before we look into it. I'll be asking you how you think the equities are going to change, how the range compositions will change. So I want you guys, when I ask that, go ahead and pop your answers in the chat, check your answers. And if you're watching this on the replay, pause before I could go on to the next slide. When I ask the question, go ahead and pause it, take a minute or two, think about how you think the equities are going to change, and try to, check your work, see where you were wrong, why you were wrong, or if you got it right. Excuse me. So flop play is pretty simple. It's a lot easier to find the equities on the flop, and then on the turn it gets a lot messier. So this might get a little complicated. It might, stick with it. And the key part here is just to learn how different turn cards affect the range interaction. First, though, we're going to do a quick, we're going to set up this flop, the flop scenario. So just so we know what the ranges are going into the turn. So we need to know what the ranges are going into the turn before we continue. So we talked about this last time. King 8-4. This is kind of the basic PioSolver setup. And the key thing here is this is the strategy that it's suggesting. This is out of position player first. First thing I want to point out, there's no leading from out of position. It says 1%, but I only solve this to 1% accuracy. If I ran it all the way to 0% where it solves it completely, this would go to 0 and it would be 100% check. Why is out of position 100% check? We talked about this last time. Because out of position only has 38% equity, he's at a big range disadvantage, so out of position is always going to check to the in position player and never choose to bet. And we talked about this last time as well. Once out of position checks, this is in position strategy. In position is going to bet every single hand in his range. Same scenario, it says we're going to check 3% of the time. Basically, if I ran this down to 0%, it would have us bet 100% of the time. And yeah, Mike, that's why I'm setting this up. We're going to, for all the examples we're going through on the turn, we're assuming it's going to go check, in position bets, and big blind calls. And so we're going to be looking at the ranges. So key thing here is going into the turn. So after the flop, going into the turn, in position has every single hand still. Harris, we don't really have a hero and a villain because we're going to be looking at both players in this range. We're looking at this as an outsider, basically. So we don't really have hero and a villain, just out of position, in position. So key takeaway one is that in position player is going to have every single hand here on this grid going into the turn because he's betting 100% of his hands for 3 big blinds. There's 10 big blinds in the pot, so 30% bet. And the reason he's betting small is just because he has a huge range advantage and he wants to bet every single hand in his range. So we're going to do the bet, and then we're just going to look quickly at what the big blind strategy is so we have an idea of what his range is going to the turn. Couple of things to point out. First, let's look at what types of hands the big blind is raising. So he's raising about 12% of the time. So let's look at his nutty hands. He doesn't have pocket kings. Pocket eights, he's raising 100% of the time. So he never has pocket eights going to the turn. There's about a sliver of it, but like I said, if I ran this to 100%, it pretty much always raised the eights. Pocket fours, always raising. So this orange color is always raised, the green color is call, and the blue color is fold. So pocket fours and pocket eights, his sets are always raising. That is very important. Now let's look at his two pairs. King eight suited, pretty much always raising. The two combos of king eight suited, there's a sliver of calling. It probably, if I ran it to 100% completion, it would always raise it, never call. King eight offsuit, same thing, pretty much always raising. It's top two pair combinations. King four suited, that's where it kind of starts to not raise, and it's just going to call with the king four suited. So king four suited is going to be one of the two pairs in the range of the big blind going to the turn. And then the 8-4 suited, the 8-4 suited is always going to be raised. And the reason it's going to call with king 4 suited and just raise the 8-4 suited, because it always wants to raise the 8-4 suited because it doesn't block a king, and so it's more likely that in position has a king that it can call with. And then with king 4 suited, it kind of blocks some of the calling range, and it gives it a stronger hand to call with. So, and then it's going to raise some. It raises king queen a very fractional, small percentage of the time that he raises some of his top pair combinations. So, key takeaway number one for the key takeaway number one. And the reason it's raising king eight suited is just that it's strong enough to stack off against overpairs and other kings, and it doesn't have to worry about getting counterfeited with the king eight suited. With the king four suited, it's a little worried about putting in a ton of money because there are some cards that can counterfeit it with the eight, and then also pocket eights is one of the stronger hands in positioned range. So key takeaway number one, and this is a big mistake a lot of people make, is they call with strong hands because they want to protect their range. But as you can see here, the computer simulation is pretty much always raising and fast playing its strong hands, and it will protect itself on the turn because basically the big blind on the turn can have like a ton of two pair cards, straights and flushes. It will use turn cards to protect itself. So for example, if a jack comes off, the big blind then can have jack 8, king jack, etc. And so you don't really need to be slow. People slow play big hands way too much. Calling hands. So pretty much we're calling with every king. With our eights, pretty much always calling with an 8 unless it's two pair or the set. With our fours, again, pretty much always calling with these fours, doing a very small amount of raise bluffing with the smaller floors. And then it won't be that important for this simulation. We'll actually look at a lot of its flush draws, jack 2. So you see here, like jack deuce suited. Basically, it's obviously folding jack deuce to spades, diamonds, and hearts, and it's just calling with the clubs. All these weak flush draws, it's just calling with. And then once it starts to get like an overcard to the 8, it sometimes starts raising it. So this is an important part for the range here. Nut flush draw. So ace deuce of clubs raising, ace 3 of clubs raising, ace 5 of clubs raising, ace 6, ace 7 of clubs raising. And then once it gets to like ace 9, because it has 2 overs to the 8 and it has more equity, it just starts calling with a lot of those flush draws. But the big blind is just folding a lot of his aces that don't have a flush draw here. So ace 7 suited, 6, 5, ace 3, ace deuce. Even a hand as strong as ace jack of spades or ace jack of hearts is just folding on the flop without a backdoor flush draw. Ace 10, only with a backdoor flush draw. And then on the offsuit ones, it needs like a diamond or a club to continue with ace jack. So it's folding a lot of aces here. So that's a key point here, is that we're folding a lot of ace high. And too many people just continue with ace highs because they just don't have enough equity. Yeah, I think that's the general big blind strategy here. So calling a lot of its pairs, jacks, tens, nines, some of these gutters. So like 8-7 off, 7-6 off, 6-5 off. It does a little bit of raising with some calling. He's folding no flush draws. He's just raising some flush draws and calling some of them, but he's never folding a flush draw. Kind of the couple of the cool bluffs that the computer always has here. This is these are the savage bluffs that most people don't ever find. These are kind of the fun ones. And look at how high a percentage that it's check raising these hands. Like the ace of clubs with either the 7, 6, or the 5. So it has the nut flush blocker and a backdoor straight draw. They're pretty much almost always raised. Key takeaway here, 12% of the time. Most people do not check raise enough. That's a key takeaway here. What is Piosalva's criteria to fold, call, or raise? Is it hand equity? Basically, yes. It's calling. It wants to call raise with hands that have enough equity to raise with. It wants to. So if we look at the equity, so it's raising with like these 90% equity hands: 8s, 4s, king 4, king 8, 8-4. Some king queen. And then for bluffs, it wants the hands that have backdoor equity or very good blockers. So for example, this ace 7 doesn't have very good equity. The ace of clubs, 7 of spades, 30%, but has very good blockers in terms of it has the ace of clubs. So when the club comes, it can bluff the nut flush. And then when like a 5, 6, or 7 comes, it can bluff the straight, and it turns some equity as well. So it's a combination of hand equity, and basically it's kind of just polarizing its range when it raises, because it's just going to start polarizing to these nut hands and its bluffs. This is a middle position opening range. King queen suited with the flush draw. Yeah, it's raising king queen. It's basically just raising king queen suited with the flush draw, and then some king queen off when it has the king of clubs. All right, so we got a lot of stuff to get through, and we only have a few. There's probably gonna be a little less Q&A because we have a lot of stuff to get through here. So let's look at our first turn card here. That was the flop. We have a good idea of the flop strategy now. So first. First turn card we're going to look at is the deuce of spades. Now, remember on the flop, in position had a 61% range advantage. So, I'm going to ask this question now. I want you guys to take a second, post it in the chat. On the deuce of spades turn, after it goes check, bet, call. So we bet the flop, big blind calls, and the deuce of spades comes out. How have equities changed on the deuce of spades turn card? And then also start to think about, we're more concerned about equities here. So I want you guys to guess what the equities now, range versus range. We just went through kind of what the big blind range is. We know in position has every hand. So how do equities change on the deuce of spades turn card? So we're looking at the king 8-4 and then the deuce of spades turn card, a complete brick. So 70-30 for in position, increase for middle position I see from someone. Another equity goes up for in position, down for out of position, little change, increase, in position goes up slightly. All right, this is why it gets much more difficult to play little. I haven't seen the correct answer once. So, the out of position player on the deuce of spades now has an equity advantage. And the reason isn't that the deuce of spades changed anything. The deuce of spades is a complete brick. The reason that out of position has a range advantage now is he's folded all his junk on the flop. And if we looked at the hands that he called with all his kings, all his 8s, all his 4s, all his flush draws, all his strongest ace highs. So all he's left with are pairs and draws. And what did out of position? In position has everything that he bet with on the flop. So in position still has queen jack, jack 10, etc. So Now the out of position player on the deuce of spades has a 52% equity advantage. In position has a 48%. So now let's look at the range composition here. So on the right, on the top, we have the out of position player. And on the bottom, we have the in position player. Now this is how we can take a look at this. In position has a set 4% of the time. Out of position 1% of the time. So that's still the same. And the out of position basically never has a set now other than deuces. So it picked up 2.5 combos of deuces. It called with deuces with the deuce of clubs. So that's where the set comes in. 2 pair. He only has 6 combos of 2 pair because he check raised most of his 2 pairs. Remember, he check raised with king 8 and 8-4. The only 2 pair he picked up was like king deuce suited, 8 deuce suited, 4 deuce suited. So he picked up some of his. This is his range after we went check, bet, call, and the deuce of spades came out. So this isn't before the turn card. It's after the turn card and there. But here's the key part. Remember when we first looked at this? Out of position had top pair 10% of the time, right? He had 11% top pair and 9% second pair and 3%. So look at this. Between second pair and under pair, he had 21% here. Now, after the deuce of spades comes out, he went from 21% to now out of position has second pair 17% of the time, and under pair 7% of the time, and 20% top pair. So he now has an 8 or better 43% of the time. Plus he has these 2 pairs instead. So almost half of his range is going to be a pair of 8s or better now. Versus before it was like 15%. So that's why out of position has made up that big equity advantage. Because he's just folded all that junk that he had before. And that's where Matt, we're gonna look at different turn cards, and you'll see how the equities affects it on different turn cards. So, this is probably to what you're getting at, Matthew. This is probably what the equities are gonna pretty much be after it goes check, bet, call before the turn card comes out. That's why I did the brick first, because the brick really doesn't change anything other than it brings in a couple of more 2-pair combos. So to answer your question, Matthew, this is probably what the equities are going to be pretty close to this after it goes check, bet, call before the turn card comes out. So basically, out of position has picked up this massive thing there. And then in position's range composition pretty much changed the same because he bet everything on the flop. So what does this do to the strategy now? Because the equities are much closer. So we talked about this. We talked about now that the equity is much closer, in position just doesn't get to bet everything. And we're going to begin to polarize our betting range because the equities are much closer. There's pretty much going to be no small betting. We're only going to be betting large. And in position is basically going to be still pushing. The in position still kind of has a nut advantage. The in position does have a nut advantage because he still has more sets. His top pairs, even though he has less top or about equal top pair, he has stronger top pairs because he has ace king. Out of position doesn't have ace king. He has more king queen because out of position check raised some of his king queens on the flop, and the in position player has more sets and 2 pairs because out of position started to check raise that. So let's look really quickly here. We got the bet to 3, call, deuce of spades. And as you can see, because the out of position doesn't have the nut advantage, he's still going to always check. He's always going to check because he doesn't have a nut advantage and the equities are still pretty close and he's out of position. Check, and then this is the key takeaway here. I didn't put an overbet into this simulation just because I didn't want to have 3 sizings, but we have a small size, which is 6. The pot is 16 big blinds. I gave it a 40% bet size, which is 6, and an 80% bet size. So 6 and 13, 40% and 80%. And as you can see here, we're only basically using the 80% bet sizing. And what does that mean? We're polarizing our range. So we're going to be checking about 40%, betting 60%, and always using the 80% sizing on this brick turn card. And basically, we're betting an 8 or better for value. So ace 8, king 8, our stronger 8s, we check at 9-8, but then 9s, 10s, jacks, queens still bet a decent amount, kings, aces, ace, king, all for value. All our kings, most of our kings are all still betting. And then we start to mix in our bluffs. We're still betting like 4s, and then we start to bluff with we still bet our flush draws. We're bluffing with some of our flush draws, bluffing with some of our good equity hands. Basically, I'm not going to try to get in too much into the turn bluffing. We're mostly just getting into the betting strategy here. And the key takeaway here is that we're going to polarize and never use a small sizing and always use the bigger sizing here on the turn. And then as you'll see here, we'll start bluffing with a lot of our ace highs because of some of the blockers. We'll bluff a lot with the ace of clubs, blocking his strongest flush draws, etc. So just a quick thing. Basically, we'll bet 13 and then big blind. Here's a key takeaway. When we start betting large here on the turn, the out of position player is going to be folding a lot of it. It makes it indifferent with his 8s. So when you see a mix here, when it shows, like, for example, 9-8 suited here, it has it folding sometimes and calling sometimes. When it's mixed here between fold and call, that means it's basically 0 EV, and the big blind is indifferent between calling and folding. So by polarizing our range on the turn to an 8 or better, a stronger 8 or better, we're basically forcing the big blind to be indifferent calling with his 8s. And he's basically only calling with, like, kings or better and, like, his overpairs and his queen 3 of clubs now are folding, jack 3 of clubs. His strongest flush, some of his weakest flush draws are starting to fold the turn now because they just don't have enough equity to continue. And so, yeah, that's a basic overview. We're going through these a little quicker because we have 4 turn cards we want to get to. But that's a basic overview of how the deuce of spades plays. So, in summary, equities are really close, and we're going to start polarizing on the turn. So the next turn card we're going to look at is the flush completers. So we're going to look at the flush completers now. So the first one we're going to look at is the ace of clubs. So same question. How do equities change on the ace of clubs turn card from the flop? So who has the equity advantage, and how big of an equity advantage do they think they have on the ace of clubs? Mike, yes, the bet 13 is 13 big blinds. I just set it up, everything in big blinds to make it easier. All right, so I have some people saying in position equity ranges, MP equity increases. High flush completer, out of position, low flush completer, in position has an advantage. MP gets a boost. All right, so on the ace of clubs, the in position player gets a big range advantage on the ace of clubs. So the out of position player's equity on the ace of clubs is 43%, and in position player has a 56% range advantage. Why is this? We're going to go to the top pair column. This is why. Top pair, out of position, 7.5%. So if you took a look on the flop, when it went bet, out of position is starting to fold a lot of these aces, right? He's folding a lot of his suited aces, anything that doesn't have a backdoor flush draw. But in position, bets every single suited ace and every ace 10 off or better. So, top pair, 7.5%. This is an ace now as top pair for the out of position. Top pair for the in position player, 27%. In position now has 27% of pair aces or better. And then he still has 2 pair sets and flushes. So even though the out of position has more flushes, and we talked about that last time, and out of position has a 13% flushes versus 5% for in position, it's just not enough to overcome this 27% aces for in position. So in position picks up a ton of aces, huge range advantage. And what is the strategy going to be? I'll let you guys pick that. What do you think the strategy is going to be for the in position player now, given that he has a 56% range advantage? What do you think the strategy is going to be for in position player on this ace of clubs after the big blind checks? So we got check, bet, call, ace of clubs. We got in position double barrels, nearly 100%, still bets, bet 60% pot. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So in position, out of position does a little bit of leading on this ace of clubs. We're not going to really look into this too much, but he has some flushes. He's going to do some reading. So he checks, and we are going to be checking still a decent amount. So some people were saying we do have a large equity advantage. So you would think with a large equity advantage on this card, we just get a bet, 100% of the time or 80%, a very high percentage of the time. And we do take one of the properties. We are going to be using the smaller sizing now because we have a large equity advantage. Our equity, remember, is 58% here. So we don't want to polarize our range because we have a large equity advantage and we want to bet small. The problem is, though, this flush advantage is that out of position still has a really big nut advantage on us. He still has a 13% flush advantage on us compared to our 5% of flushes, because most of our flushes are the ace high flushes. This is the key part here. All our flushes are mostly the ace of clubs. So that's why we're at a flush disadvantage here on this card. And we just don't get a bet. If we start betting 80%, then big blind gets to start check raising a lot because he has a lot of flushes. He has a lot of like ace 8 off 2 pairs, ace 4 2 pairs. Not a lot of those, but he just starts to get a check raising his flushes and put a lot of money in the pot. So we want to protect ourselves with some of these. So these weaker aces are checking back, like ace 4 through ace 8, just because even ace king a little bit is going to check back. Mostly when it doesn't have a club in its hand, because it just is really hard for it to face a check raise. So we have a lot. Exactly, Matt. I don't know if I explained that well. We can't have the nut flush, which our most common flush is the nut flush, but we can't have it because the ace of clubs is on the board. So, and we just don't have as many suited kings as we do suited aces. So the reason we don't get to just bet everything is because we need to protect ourselves a little bit from getting check raised. Okay, in reality, people don't check raise enough, so you don't need to protect yourself. I would always bet ace king, ace queen, ace jack, etc., because people don't check raise enough, and they're not going to put a lot of pressure on you, even though they have a flush advantage here. So if you see, like here, we're betting like our queen high flushes, jack high flushes. We're still betting our aces with like a club. We're still betting some of these stronger aces, etc. But the key concept here is that we're using the smaller sizing because of our equity advantage. And we're using the smaller sizing, but we're going to start checking back more because of that nut advantage that the big blind has. So this is an example of having an equity advantage, but not having a nut advantage. So there's those are two big properties, nut advantage and equity advantage. And that's kind of going to be the theme of it. And some people were asking, why is it betting these smaller pairs? And it's using these to start to bluff with. So is in position bluffing at all? Yes, Doug. In position starting to bluff it a lot. And it's starting to use these small pairs with a club. So like pocket fives with a club, pocket sixes with a club. These are going to be a lot of its like triple barrel bluffs. And percentage of the pot, it's betting about 40% of the pot here. So it's always using the bet six and not the bet 13. And yes, we're always betting our sets, pocket eights, pocket fours. It is checking some of the bigger sets, aces and kings, just as there's not as many hands that can call. It's betting kings with the club. But, what do you think the ratio of value to bluffs are? The reason that the ratio is just you're always gonna have some more bluffs than you are calls. All right, so here's a key concept: you're always gonna be bluffing more than you're value betting because on earlier streets, and the reason is so on the flop you're gonna bluff the most. So as we saw on the flop, we bet 100% of our hands, and the reason you want to bluff the most on the flop is that on the turn in the river, some of your bluffs are going to turn into value hands. So when some of your bluffs turn into value hands, now you have less bluffs for later streets. So now on the turn, we want to still have more bluffs than value hands. And because some of our bluffs now, so for example, a lot of our bluffs here are going to contain a club. Like the 5 of clubs, pocket 5s with the 5 of clubs, pocket 6 with the 6 of clubs, pocket 7s with the 7 of clubs. We're starting to bluff those hands, but those hands are going to turn into a flush on some rivers, right? And then we're just going to check those back because now we have showdown value. So that's why it's starting to bluff some of these pocket 7s with no club, pocket 6s with no club, pocket 5s with no club, because you want to be bluffing more on the turn, because now when a club comes on the river, you're going to have you need some non-club hands that you want to bluff the river with. So the reason it's bluffing, say, pocket 7s here, with betting pocket 7s with no club, is that when a club comes out, let's say we bet, he calls, and let's say the queen of clubs comes out and he goes check. Look at now he's starting to bluff here with the 7 of spades, 7 of diamonds, 7 of hearts, 7 of diamonds some of the time. So that's just like one example. That's not really what we're getting into in this webinar. But yeah, so you want to have enough bluffs so that you can have bluffs on later streets when some of your bluffs turn into value. I hope I'm explaining that well enough, but we can answer that question more at the end of the webinar. I really don't have a specific like ratio that I use. Someone asked, why is it checking 2 pair? It's interesting. It's checking pure king 8, and the reason, let's look at the equity of king 8. It's still a high equity hand, and I think it's just using that as it can't face a check raise. And with king 8, it's blocking a lot of the calling range. So a lot of the calling range to this bet is going to be either a king or an 8 or flushes. So when we bet, he's getting value from king 8, but I think it's just concerned about, like, he's folding all his 8s and only calling with a king. So he's blocking some of his, like, calling range, I guess. Sometimes it's hard to understand why Pio is doing some of this stuff. But, yeah, that's the ace of clubs. We're going to move along here because we're running long here. So ace of clubs, we covered that. Let's look at the low flush completer now. The 3 of clubs. So how do equities change on the 3 of clubs turn card from the flop? I see some answers on here. We want to know what the equities look like on the 3 of clubs turn card. See, Doug saying in position has a nut advantage, but not a range advantage. Out of position, equity goes up. Out of position, equity goes up. And Doug hit this perfect. That in position has a range advantage. Or sorry, in position has a nut advantage, but out of position has the range advantage. And I believe that is going to be correct. So 3 of clubs, yeah. Out of position goes to 53% equity. In position, 47. So this is similar to the deuce of spades. The 3 of clubs is kind of a brick. The 3 is a brick because it doesn't really complete a lot of 2 pairs, etc. It doesn't bring any straights, but it does bring the flush, the club. So out of position, 53%, 47%. So all the pair ranges stay the same. Basically, out of position's top pair went from 10% to 20%. The big thing that changed here is the flushes. Out of position has 11% flushes now. In position has 9% though. So that's a key thing. On the ace of clubs, the in position player only had 5% flushes. Now on the three of clubs, he has 9% flushes. And that's because now in position can have the nut flush. So in position has top pair advantage in terms of he has stronger top pairs, and he has a flush advantage in terms of he has stronger flushes. Now out of position has a few more flushes than him, but in position has stronger flushes. And so the in position player basically just has nothing a lot more. That's where the range advantage comes from. Out of position has nothing 21% of the time, ace high or nothing. In position has ace high or nothing 40%. So in position still has nothing quite a bit now. And we'll look at this. Three of clubs. Here's the equity, 56.43. And again, this is, even though out of position has an equity advantage, he's not leading very often here because he doesn't have a nut advantage in terms of he check raised a lot of his nut flush draws, and in position has a lot stronger flushes and stronger top pairs and still has all the sets and two pairs. So as a proportion, in position still has stronger hands even though out of position has an equity advantage. And here, as you could, what kind of makes sense, equities are close, so in position wants to start to polarize more. If I had it do one bet size, it would probably just choose to do the 13. I did two bet sizes to try to show on some of these examples, bet small and bet big. Here you can see he's using both sizings, but it's basically just using a mix with, there's no hands that really prefer to use one sizing or the other. So in general, you can just use like the big sizing and that will be fine and start to polarize your range here. That would be my way to my simple way to implement the strategy. I'm not going to be like, I'm going to bet Jack 10 of spades small half the time and big half the time and check half the time or a third of the time each. I'm just going to bet big or check here mostly and polarize my range. And I'm polarizing because equities are close. And that's what you want to do when the equity advantages are close. So as you can see, in position has all these nut flushes. Stronger, he has stronger top pairs, ace, king, ace, queen. And one thing that I want to point out that Pile Solver does that you really don't need to do in real life. It's like, for example, let's find a good example. For example, like he's going to check back. Pile Solver's checking back 10-9 of clubs like half the time. So it has it checking 10-9 of clubs 42%, so a flush. In reality, you don't need to check that back. And the reason that it will check back these 10-9 of clubs is because if it goes check, 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 and then let's say like a deuce of hearts comes off, that's the out of position players are going to start doing some overbetting, which really doesn't happen in real life. And basically, the out of position player is going to start to attack like a semi-capped range because he doesn't have as many flushes that check back, and the big blind still has a lot of flushes. So that's why it's checking back some of these flushes, but in reality, you don't ever need to do that. Do lower cards favor the out of position player, or is it a function of flop texture? Most of the time, the lower cards are just going to be neutral because they don't improve anyone. Like the three of clubs doesn't really improve anything in terms of like what we can look at here on the Range Explorer. The out of position, like, so he's making, let's look at his two pair. So he has two combos of two pair now. King 8 suited. He should have King 3 suited. He's going to have some, I don't know why. Three of clubs, Range Explorer. There we go. So, like, the only thing that the 3 changed was that out of position picked up some King 3 suited and some 4-3 suited two pairs. So that's the only thing that changed really on the, like, 3. It's kind of, it's a brick, but it just completes a lot of these flushes. So, yeah, in general, the in position loses the range advantage. In position now has a top pair advantage and a flush advantage in terms of it has stronger flushes, stronger top pairs. In position just has a ton of ace high flushes, and the big blind check raise most of its ace high flushes on the flop. So we have 2 more to go through really quick, and we're at 50 minutes. So let's go through this again. We'll go a little longer today. That's fine. Straight completer on the 7 of hearts. So how do equities change on this 7 of hearts turn card from the flop? Fred, no, it's not a brick if it completes the flush, but I was just referring to, instead of the 3 of clubs, it was the 3 of hearts. I was referring to, is it a brick in terms of does it change any 2 pair combinations or sets, etc. It's not like an ace that changes what top pair is or what straights come in. It's obviously not a brick with the flush. So 7 of hearts, we have some benefits out of position. Out of position has a range advantage because he has more load cards to make it straight. So this 7 of hearts is going to play a little bit like the brick. The out of position should have a range advantage now, but it's not because he has a lot of straights. It's just because of the top pair advantage. So straightening board card now, the 7 of hearts. Out of position has gone to 55% equity. In position, 45%. But the key thing is here, a couple people said it benefits the out of position player because he has straights, but it really didn't, because a straight, he has 9 combos of straights. That's only 4% of his range. So it's not a large percentage of his range now is straight. It's this top pair that we've gone through on every example. This has been the case. He is top pair 21% of the time, and second pair 14%, and an under pair 7%. So he has 42% top pair, under pair, second pair. And that's not even including his sets and straights. And out of position now has picked up some 2 pairs with the 7. So those are the main things that's changed here on the 7 of hearts. Nothing's really changed for the in position player. 7 of hearts. I want to look at those 2 pairs. So 13 combos of 2 pair now. So now out of position has the King 7 suited, 8-7 suited, 8-7 offsuit, 7-4 suited. So he picked up some more 2 pairs that in position does not have. But again, not doing a lot of leading. We're doing a little bit of leading, but not a lot. And the reason we're not leading is because of that advantage that the in position player still has stronger top pairs and still has these sets that we don't have. It's still the in position player, while the nut advantage for the out of position player, he has the straights and a couple more 2 pairs. It's just the top pairs for in position are much stronger than the out of position player. So for example, out of position has King deuce, King 3, King 4, versus in position has King 8 as his worst top pair. So, and he still has ace king. He has the overpair of aces. He still has a set of 7. So the proportion of stronger hands is just really strong in the in position's range. That's why there's no leading. And in position, as has been the kind of the theme, in position starts to polarize again because he's at an equity disadvantage. So he's going to be checking more, 62%. So keep in mind, he's checking more than when he had the last example. In position had 48%, and he was checking like 50% of the time. Now he's checking 60% of the time, and always using the big sizing and polarizing. So he's betting his 2 pairs, his sets, over pairs, checking hands like queens, jacks, and 10s because those aren't part of a polarized range. No longer betting his like ace 8, and then starting to bluff with some like of these gut shots like ace 6 and ace 5. And yeah. So key takeaway here is that now in position is at an equity disadvantage and starts to polarize his range more. And now we'll look at the last example before the summary, and I think the summary will help get to all the points together that I'm trying to make. So this is the last point. The paired board card, the 8 of diamonds. How do equities change on the 8 of diamonds turn card from the flop? And this is an important one. How does the range composition shift from the flop to the turn on the 8 of diamonds turn card that pairs the board? Any guesses on this one? Nut advantage for in position, range advantage for out of position, no change. Crushes OP range. OP has more 8s in his range, right? So he has more sets now. It favors OOP. So OOP now has a slight range advantage, 52% on the 8 of diamonds. But here's the big thing that changes on the 8 of diamonds that hasn't changed on any of the other board cards. Cards we looked at, the out of position, if we consider an 8 the nuts, the out of position player now has a huge nut advantage on the 8. He has 20% trips. And you'll see in the strategy, because now he has the equity advantage of 52% and he has the nut advantage, we're going to see the big blind player start to lead a lot on this 8 of diamonds turn card. And the big thing here is the out of position player has trips 12% of the time versus only 3% for the out of position or in position player. And he still has that top pair advantage and third pair now, which is a pair of 4s. So he has an equity and a nut advantage. We can go ahead and look at that in here. Call the 8 of diamonds. And now you can see it's still not like a huge leading range, but he has a 22% leading range here. And he's leading a lot of 8s. You know, he's mixing kind of between checking and betting, but a lot of these 8s are starting to mix now. And then it's between bet and check. And also he can start betting he's betting some of his stronger kings for value because he's protected, because he has a lot of, he can start leading a lot of these like stronger top pairs because he's protected with a lot of 8x in his range. And then he'll start leading some of his flush draws. Like he's leading some of these weaker flush draws now that can't check call. So that's kind of the general strategy here. Let's look at the check. And again, as in the theme, equity disadvantage, out of position, in position player is going to, he's still betting 40% of the time, and he's just going to mostly start polarizing his range again because equities run close. So he's polarizing, he's betting a lot of his ace. Polarizing doesn't necessarily mean you can't bet, you can only bet with an 8. He's betting like king queen for a polarizing sizing. King jack bets some of the time. So stronger kings, basically a stronger king or better, are starting to bet for the in position player. Is he leading his counterfeited 2 pairs king 4? I would guess no. I don't think he's leading a few of them as blockers. He's leading some of these, but he's not leading them any more than he's leading some of his like king jack and stuff. So, so to wrap up, and we'll do a little bit of Q&A since some of this was complicated stuff. We're at an hour. And this might be the most important slide. This next one, the summary. So looking back, and this is probably a webinar you'll want to rewatch a couple of times. This is pretty complicated stuff, pretty high-end stuff, but good continuation. And this is kind of what a lot of high-end players are thinking about. In summary, these are the key takeaways. Equity and nut advantage are what allow betting frequencies and sizings. So equity, how much equity your range has, as we've seen. When you have more equity, you get to bet more often. We've seen that in the 4 examples. And nut advantage as well. So it's not just equity. There was the example on the ace of clubs. On the ace of clubs, the in position had a 7% equity advantage, but big blind had so many flushes, and the in position just doesn't get to start betting everything because he doesn't have as many flushes as the big blind. So equity and nut advantage combined are what allow betting frequencies and sizings. So that's point number one. That's basically the main takeaway of this webinar. The equity and nut advantage. And nut advantage basically is the range composition and how often you have really strong hands and how often you don't have really strong hands. And then equity is just kind of the makeup of your whole range. Composition of your range is very important. It's not just how many combos, but it's the percentage of the range. So, for example, on the 7 hearts, the straight completer, the big blind has straights, but it's only like 3% of his range. So it's not really a huge deal. So a lot of people justify decisions like, well, he has straights and I don't. But the straight is such a small percentage of his range that it doesn't make a huge difference in the hand. And then this is the second biggest point. This is the second biggest takeaway. The big blind often closes the equity gaps quickly from the flop to turn since he folds all of his junk on the flop. So, point number 2, big blind, as in every example here, got to basically even equity on the flop because he folded all of his junk hands on the flop. And point number 3, and you often see this and people don't know why. We know why we use small flop sizings now. We use the small flop sizing because we have such a large equity advantage and nut advantage on the flop, at least on this board texture. And then we use big polar turn sizings after it goes check call because now equities are much closer after the big blind is check called. So that's the reason for we're using like a 30% sizing on the flop. And then on a lot of the examples, we started using that 80% polar sizing. And if I put it in the simulation, if I put in an overbet of like 120%, like a 40%, 80%, and 120%, the pile solver would probably start using like the 120% overbet sizing a lot on the turn as well. So 3 takeaways I want you to take away. Equity and nut advantage are what allow the betting frequencies and sizings. The big blind often closes the equity gap quickly from the flop to the turn. So I think you guys kind of learned that. On the first example, everyone said the end position player had the equity advantage, but then you guys quickly figured out on all the other examples that they were very close. And then this all allows for the small flop sizing on the flop because of our equity advantage and big polar turn sizings. So we made it through it. This is very complicated stuff, I know. This is pretty high-end stuff, pretty complicated. So we're at an hour and 2 minutes. I'm going to do 10 minutes of Q&A, and then we'll wrap this up. So we'll go 10 minutes longer. So let's fire in some of these Q&A. I'm going to start from the top. So yeah, I'm going to go through the top and then keep filing in some questions. And I'm going to kind of go rapid fire through some of these questions. So earlier, Ralph asked, is overbet still strong on in position player after it goes bet call? Yeah, so this is kind of here what I was talking about, these big polar sizings. I only did a 40% and an 80% turn sizing, but if I added a 120% sizing or 150% for in-position player, it would be used on those brick cards where in-position wants to be polarizing. Likely an overbet would be used a lot on the turn. Bluff to value ratio, we talked to that a little bit. You're going to have more bluffs than value because some of your bluffs are going to turn into value on later streets. So you need to have a lot of bluffs, more on the flop, less on the turn, and then less on the river. But you're going to have most people don't bluff nearly enough. Jason, I saw this. You were asking, why did it bet 5-5 but not 6-6? I don't remember what exact hand it was. The reason it's starting to bet 5s and 6s was just it's gonna betting some of them to turn them into bluffs on a later street, and 5s are just weaker than 6s and have less showdown value because 6s can beat 5s, and 5s didn't really beat any pairs because the pair below it was a 4 on the board. So when you see it start to bluff with pairs, when you bluff with pocket pairs, you just want to start picking your smallest pocket pairs to bluff with. Clear out a lot of these comments and answers from earlier. A lot of the bluff to value ratios. We've covered that. Um, so Michael asks, overall, if big blind were to call pre-flop with a tighter range with a 2.5x open, wouldn't this increase his equity range across these hands? Yes, 100%. And you would see this when like someone flats in position, they normally have a pretty big equity advantage on the out of position on player. Thank you, Jason, for the compliment. How many hours a month do you study this complicated stuff? Right now during the World Series, not much at all. But in general, like I'll spend like 5 to 10 hours a week. So basically, what I'll do is I can run a script with PioSolver. So let's say I take this same situation, middle position versus big blind, and I can just let it run for like a day on my computer. It might take like 12 hours. I can have it run like 64 different flops. And then I can kind of have all of them, and I'll export it to a spreadsheet, which you can do in the program, and it will give me like the frequencies on every flop. And what I'll do is kind of use it like flashcards, where on different textures, I'll kind of guess what my equity is on different textures and what frequencies I'm using. And then when there's like ones that I don't know, I can pull up the simulation and kind of look into it, how I've looked into it, look at the range explorer, see why we're doing things that we're doing. And this is kind of the basic way that I think is really good to use PioSolver in an effective way, not to just cookie cutter copy the strategy. I'm not trying to do that. More so, you're learning why is it doing things that it does. What factors would you consider for deciding between 80% and versus 120% polarizing? Good question, Benjamin. Stack depth is the main thing. So as stacks are deeper, my polarizings are going to be a lot bigger. And as stacks are shallower, your polarizings. So for example, if you're playing 20 big blinds deep, a polarizing might be 50% pot because there's not much to play. But when you're playing like 150 big blinds deep, your polarizing might want to be like 150%. Ricardo, how are the reads that you have on players come into this? When you know a player is sticky or bluffy or tight, blind, defender, etc. These trump everything. What we're looking at here is like theory stuff. So this is studying theory. And what we're trying to learn here is identifying when we have an equity advantage, when we have a nut advantage, and in general, what type of sizings we want to use, and like what our kind of general strategy should be on those boards. I'm not trying to cookie cutter copy the strategy that PioSolver does. What I'm trying to do is understand range interaction and the composition of ranges. So the big takeaway here is when the big blind check calls, he has something now a lot. You know, that's the big takeaway here, and that you just don't get a bombs away now on every turn and river. And that you see some players do that, and that's why you should start to polarize. Now the big takeaway here is I know like I should be polarizing a lot, or realizing like, for example, on the ace of clubs, why I don't want to polarize and I use the smaller sizing. So the ace of clubs, I think, was the only card that we looked at that we don't use the polarizing sizing on. So that's the type of stuff that I'm trying to learn from this. Not should I bet Jack 7 suited 30% of the time. That's not what you should be taking away from this. What you should be taking away from this is these 3 points: the equity and nut advantages. So learning the range compositions, learning how equities change on different cards. So this one, and then when to use smaller sizings or polar sizings. Those are like the 3 big takeaways.